Hey guys, it's Sarah from Just My Typewriter, and I'm dressed like a mad scientist because today I want to do a little bit of testing. So when I started typewriter collecting, my very first typewriter was a Smith Corona Corsair Deluxe, which I have since learned not to love as much as when I started. When I was using this typewriter, the very first time I got it, I would get my fingers stuck between keys on the keyboard, and I thought that that was normal until I got a big standard desk machine, a Royal HH, that I liked using a lot better, and my fingers didn't get stuck in between the keys. Now, I realized recently that this can really impact how I feel about a machine. I have a Remington Travel-Riter that I really love. I love the action on it, it's so snappy, I love the size of it, it's a little bit smaller than some of my other portables. I really love this typewriter, but I will not sit down and use it for a long letter. And I realized it's because my fingers get tired using this key shape. So today I thought we'd sit down, test a bunch of different key shapes, and see which one I like the best. So, on to the lab. This is my Tower Chieftain. It is a machine that I don't use very often, but it does have very specific round keys. These are round plastic keys. They're pretty flat, they don't have any dips in them for your fingers. And I don't mind these keys so much, they're pretty close together, so I don't feel like my finger gets stuck very often in between them. So we're gonna start with this one and test out these round plastic keys. Oh yeah, I locked it. So what I'm noticing here is that my nails are a little long right now, and so I feel like because of the circular shape, they almost feel like they're bending a little bit because I type with my index fingers, which I'm not supposed to do. The pressure of it seems like it's going toward the edge of the key, and it flattens my keys out a little bit. Or if I adapt, I'm supposed to type this way, right? And then my fingers wouldn't have that problem. But because I hunt and peck on typewriters only, I type correctly on the computer, I feel like that impacts how they feel. So this is my Consul 1511, my Mystery Sentry machine. I love the aesthetics of this typewriter. I actually really like the size of this typewriter. It feels hefty for a portable. I don't often have it slide around very much, but it seems not as wide as some of the other square-based machines I've had before. I do like this machine. I've had some trouble with the keys before. I sometimes get fatigue typing on these guys. Now these are square plastic keys. They're a little bit rounded on the corners. Again, there's not a ton of space between them, so my finger doesn't get stuck in between them very often. So these are square-based keys. So let's give this one a try. What I do like about this, I think, better than the Tower, is that there's an indentation in the key. So my fingers more naturally angle themselves a little bit, so I'm not putting a ton of pressure on the sides of my nails, because there's that little dip in the key, which I think just makes it a little bit more natural. One thing I will say is I really dislike the spacebar placement on this machine. I do the spacebar with my thumb, and there's not a ton of space there for the space bar to go down and come back up. Like, that's a really short travel. And when I hit it, it doesn't have as much reaction, I think, as the keys do, how far they go down. So it doesn't feel like I don't feel like it's happening. When I hit the space bar, I can see it, but I don't feel like I'm actually doing it. And because I'm using the side of my thumb, I rest it here or hit the side of this pretty easily, because of the spacebar not sitting very high up above it. Okay, so here is the Corsair Deluxe. This is the first typewriter I really had that I typed on quite frequently. I remember staying up at night and just like wanting to play on my typewriter, and I would type out almost like journal entries, and I would just fill pages and pages and pages. And one thing I always had trouble with in this machine specifically is I would get my fingers stuck between keys. They would slide off the keys. These are a little bit slipperier, a little shinier than some of the other Smith Corona keys. So my fingers, when I'd hunt peck, would slide, and something about the space in between some of these keys is just a little bit bigger than keys on other machines. There's like this little quadrant between 4 keys that is just big enough for my finger to get stuck in, and the bottom of these keys is actually kind of sharp. So I would get my finger stuck in here and then pull it out and scrape up my finger just from using the machine. So I remember that using this machine, and so I don't actually use this typewriter very often because of that experience. I have typewriters that I like typing on better, even though I love this machine and it's never going anywhere. The typing experience is actually something that I don't particularly enjoy because of that kind of design of the keys. But I do like the Smith Corona key shape quite a bit. It's not a square. It's a little bit thinner at the bottom than it is at the top, and I kind of like that. And there's a dip in the keys as well, a little shallower than the Consul we just tried, but I do kind of like that key shape. But the space between the keys on this guy and the sharpness at the bottom of these plastic keys always gets me. I don't know if you saw that, I just slipped while trying to type the D on that last line. That's the kind of stuff I have with this machine. I feel like even though there's these little dips in the keys, I feel like I slide a lot on this typewriter. And part of that is because the typewriter itself is sliding. This is a problem that I have with ultra portables, is that they are not heavy enough to weigh themselves down with gravity so that they don't slide while typing. It's a huge problem I have with this machine specifically. It does have little rubber feet that are supposed to grip the surface of the table, but I've noticed even when it's gripping the surface of the table, it slides, especially on shinier surfaces like a typewriter standard table. And so when it's turning this way and I'm trying to type as it's going, I think that causes more sliding. And even if you just look at the angle of that, I'm sliding right in underneath these keys with my fingers as I'm typing if it slides. See, I just did it. I got stuck. Oh, I hate that feeling. You're just gonna have to ignore the sound of my fridge in the background. But after I had that Smith Corona Corsair Deluxe, I got into bigger, heavier desk standard models. I got a few of these all around the same time. So I got this Royal Victory model. This is my grandfather's machine. I got this around the same time that I got an Underwood Model 6 and a Royal HH Elite, which is one of my favorite typewriters to actually type on. I love that machine. What's interesting about this machine and Royal 10s, which I've had before, is that it has glass top keys. So it's got a little piece of glass with a silver colored ring around it, and then a paper insert with the letter printed on it underneath the glass. So this is a different feel of key. These are on older machines. This machine is from 34. So it's a little bit of an older machine, and I got into these types of typewriters after having that Smith Corona Corsair Deluxe, which slid everywhere. This guy is not going anywhere. In fact, I had a lot of trouble setting him on this table because he's so big. Obviously this typewriter isn't super well adjusted, but what I'm noticing is for some reason, when I'm typing with one finger over here and pushing the carriage with my other hand, I am using my fingertip, but there's no dip in these keys, but they're also not too big to the point where they're like bending my nail. I feel like these are smaller than the ones on that Tower Chieftain, but I do notice that when I start using my right hand, I'm using my nail to push down the key. I don't know why I'm doing that. I don't have an explanation, but it could be because of the glass top keys and the size of them. There's obviously a lot of space here between keys, like I can fit my whole finger in between rows without pushing down on keys too much, but there's softer edges. So I'm not getting that same snagging problem that I would get on the Smith Corona machine. So I do kind of like that. It's just a lot of space here, but the pitch of this keyboard is not very high. The keys are not super high from each other. I've had keyboards before that the pitch was like really angled. I had an Olympia SM7 that I had that on, and it made it really difficult for me to want to use that typewriter because the angle of the keyboard was so drastic from top to bottom. So this one, I think the pitch is good. I like the space between keys because my fingers aren't getting snagged in there. I don't like how flat the keytops are. I wish they had a little bit of an indentation into them so that my fingers set on them a little bit better. But I do overall like this style. Here we are at the Royal Futura, which is one of my favorite machines. I've talked about it a lot, and why it's my favorite is because of this pop-top button here. I just really love that. This is a tombstone style key, so you might see on other machines, older Royals, they have tombstone shaped glass top keys. These are tombstone shaped plastic. Try saying that 5 times fast. Maybe I need some more espresso. These are tombstone shaped plastic keys. They're really chunky. I find like they're really thick. They seem really tall. But what this does is it prevents you from really sliding in between keys in the rows. Again, like a really subtle pitch here. There's not a ton of rise to the keyboard. I really like typing on this machine. I think the action is pretty easy. I like the keys themselves. There's a little bit of a dip here in the key, not much, but because they have this deeper key to them, I find that my fingers don't get stuck in between them very often because there's just not a ton of space between these keys. Hard to clean, I will give it that. It is difficult to clean in between keys that are like this because you can't really get in there with like a rag or a Q-tip. But I think this helps with the typing action because there's not a ton of space here between things for my fingers to get stuck while using. And I do already know that I like typing on this machine. I do really like the feel of this. Obviously it's a little bit of a looser feel than some of the other machines. I find that with a lot of Royals they seem a little bit looser, maybe not as snappy in their typing style. But I do like these keys. I think this rounded top is small enough so it doesn't feel like it's widening out my nail beds when I'm hitting the top of the key. It seems to form them pretty well. So I do like that. I think that's an interesting shape. I like the tombstone style shape. I think it's a good one. It's kind of opposite of Smith Corona's, where it's wider on the bottom than it is at the top. So I know we've already looked at the Smith Corona machines with the Corsair Deluxe, but this is my current favorite typewriter to use. This is my go-to machine. This is my Smith Corona Clipper, which is from the 5 Series, and I love the 5 Series typewriters. Something about this machine's setup specifically, I really gravitate toward using when typing just about anything. I leave it out on a table so that I can really quickly use it. Now, the key shape is the same basic design as the Corsair Deluxe, but I noticed that the keys on this machine specifically feel a little bit less slick. There's that divot there in the key. It's still got the shape of the Smith Corona keys, and there's still quite a bit of space here between keys, so if you slip, you still will get that space there. But what I really like is that these edges aren't as sharp. On the Corsair Deluxe, this is just a little bit thicker, and so when you get your finger stuck, it's a really sharp edge. These do not feel as sharp to me, and they have a little bit of this bottom here, which makes them smaller so that when you get your finger stuck, it's not as sharp. And this is my favorite machine to use right now. So I really like the typing style on this and the action on this machine. And it is different than using that Corsair Deluxe. And I think what the Corsair Deluxe's problem is it additionally is also sliding. This one doesn't have that as much because it's just a little bit heftier to use. So this is the Smith Corona Clipper. The keyboard setup also is a little bit different here, so you'll notice the margin release is on the right side of the keyboard. On the Smith Corona Corsair Deluxe, it's up at the top left of the keyboard. The backspace is over here above my shift key. On some of my machines, my backspace has been over here on the right side. I'm pretty used to using the right side of the keyboard for backspace now, so I do have to adjust anytime it's on the opposite side of the keyboard, but I love the setup of this. The pitch is pretty shallow. Like there's not a huge rise between key rows here, and I like that. And I like the space bar on this as well. I think design-wise it matches the case pretty well because it's that same gray color. But even though there's not a ton of space here between the bottom of this part of the typewriter and the space bar, I still feel like when I press it, I have pretty far to go, and I'm never going to hit this case piece here because it is cut out. On the Consul, the spacebar was in front of this bottom base piece, and that meant that I was hitting the casing of the machine itself. But because this is part of this bottom row, and there's a cutout here, I feel like I don't have that same problem, and it feels pretty tight here as well. Not like the machine isn't working, but it feels like the spring on there is pretty good and reactive. That is something I noticed on the Smith Corona machines. That Royal that we just tried has a little bit of slop to it, right? There's a little bit of space. It's not super precise. I feel like the Smith Corona 5 Series specifically are really precise. There's not a ton of wiggle room in between pieces, and I really like that. I think it creates a much tighter action in the keys, and I really prefer that to some of the other typewriters that I have in my collection. And finally, here's my Remington Travel-Riter. This is the machine that kind of started this what key shape do I like best process for me, because I was sitting down to write a letter to somebody on this machine, and as I was typing, I realized my fingers really started to hurt. And I realized it was because of these keys. So these are square shape based keys, kind of like on that console. They do have a pretty deep divot in them, which is nice for the pads of your fingers. They are a bit sharp on the edges, so if your finger gets stuck in there, it hurts coming out of there. It's a little bit closer row-wise than the Smith Corona machine, and the keys themselves are a little bit thicker. But something about the size of these keys, these are a little bit smaller than those on the console, and it's a compact machine, right? It is a one-color typewriter. It's not bicolor. It is pretty short, pretty shallow, and not very wide. It's like the miniature version of the Quiet-Ritter. I guess it was built for better travel, and I think that means that the keys themselves are also just smaller. They're not as big as those console keys, and I think that can lead to some of the discomfort I have when using these keys because they are just smaller to use and a little bit more sharp and angled. One thing I will say is on the console, they had square edges, but the edges themselves, the key tops weren't very sharp. On this one, it's squared. The top, they're rounded. On the bottom, they're pointy. So you have an angle here at the bottom of these keys, and that just becomes sharp on your finger pads. If you're typing properly, you probably don't even notice, but because I hunt and peck, I run into these sharp corners quite frequently, and it tires out my fingers a lot faster than a more rounded design, even at the top of these keys. If they would have continued this softness around the top edges of the keys to the bottom, I might not be considering getting rid of this machine because I really love the action of this machine. I have a cotton ribbon on it, which I also really like. I love the size. It's so snappy. Really, really enjoy how this machine is put together. I think the ribbon mechanism is dumb, but that's the way I feel about all Remington typewriters. But the keys themselves, because they're so sharp and angled on the bottom, it's really hard for me to want to use this machine just because I get tired using it so quickly. If it wouldn't ruin them, I'd love to file it down to make it a little bit softer. But this flat top across the top bends out your nails a little bit, unlike the keys that had smaller tops, like the tombstone shape, or even the circular shape on the glass top. That rounded edge is smaller, so your fingers aren't spreading out your nails. But when you are hunting and pecking like I am, it seems to flatten out the bottom of your nails, which isn't great for saving your mani or protecting long nails. Not great for long nails in general if you're typing like I do. If you type like a real person who's supposed to be using these machines, you're probably fine, but I don't do that. So as you can see from all this very rigorous testing, I am the Goldilocks of typewriter key shapes. There are a lot of things that can impact how a machine feels and how you gravitate toward one machine over the others. Things like the action on a machine, the different functions or features, how the margins are set up, the shape of the return lever, the size of it, the weight of it. And I find that key shapes more often than not can also really impact how I feel about using a typewriter for a longer piece of work. Something like my Smith Corona Corsair Deluxe or my Travel-Riter, my Remington Travel-Riter, I really like both these machines, but for some reason, I will not sit down and use them for a longer letter. I always gravitate toward my Smith Corona clipper over them. And I think part of the reason there is just because the key shape design doesn't work for my fingers. But that doesn't mean it won't work for you, and I always encourage everybody to test out a typewriter before they buy it for the first time, just so you can figure out the feel of it and find what you like best. And this is something I've only learned after having and fixing quite a few typewriters. I didn't know when I only had one that I could have preferences about things like key shapes. If you're interested in more typewriter content, I do some other videos on this YouTube channel as well as on Instagram at just.my.typewriter. I want to thank you all so much for watching and remind you, you're just my typewriter. Comment down below what key shape you like the best on your typewriters, or which typewriter you gravitate toward the most when you have to write something longer. And I bet you probably really like the key shape on that machine.